What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be going over all of the maps in the T5S2 Season 3 map pool, which were just released in their entirety yesterday and are available now at tts40k.com/maps. So first off, before we get into this, if you're looking at this video going, what the heck is a T5S2? What are you talking about, Trevi, you weirdo? We'll go over some general basics right here. T5S2 stands for the Tactical Tortoise Tabletop Simulator Tournament Series. It's 5 T's and 2 S's for people keeping track. It is an online global ranking system for Warhammer 40k games on Tabletop Simulator. Think of ITC, but for online. And over on the Tactical Tortoise Discord server, we play a bunch of tournaments, all of which are ranked in the T5S2 series. Now, that's not to say necessarily that all of the events in T5S2 use this map pool. A lot of them do, but a lot of independent servers use their own map pools. But for the events on the server, which constitute probably 50% of the total events in the ranking, we all use these maps. If you want to learn more about joining T5S2 and playing in events, getting your events ranked, head on over to tts40k.com. That has all the info you need. And check the link down in the description down below to join our Discord server. That's where we run all of these. Over on the Discord, we run weekly standard pods, launching 2 to 3 every week, just about. And you can get on those by jumping into a wait list, and eventually you'll get added to one of those events. If you are a patron of Tactical Tortoise, you'll get added to those first. You get priority access. The standard pods run 1 round a week, but we do also have rapid fire pods, which have a small entry fee. The other pods are free, and those will run over the course of 1 week. And in addition, over on the server, we have some special events as well. If you're watching this video when it comes out this weekend, February 20th, 2021, we are having a one-day RTT style event. That's going to be super fun. That's on Saturday, and it's going to be a good time. Full day of 40K, as they say. Each season for T5S2 is biannual, so we run one every 6 months. And at the end of that season, we have an invitational tournament. You probably have seen the coverage of the last 2 invitationals up on the YouTube channel and up on the Twitch at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV. We take the top 16 people from the ranking, we make them fight each other. It's super fun. We play a billion games of 40k, and that's some of the best 40k that we have on the YouTube channel. So like I said before, if you want to get on those, head on over to tts40k.com, get in those events, start getting your points, and in June, when we do the Season 3 Invitational, maybe you'll be one of the invitees. Wouldn't that be cool? You can win lots of cash and prizes and stuff. It's not real cash, it's gift cards, but you know, it's close enough. But anyway, we're talking about the T5S2 Season 3 maps and some of the design ethos going into them. So I think we'll go down the line of these maps by their listing in the GT packet. So starting with 1.1, we have Retrieval Mission, map name Beachhead. For the events that we run, each mission has one map that's associated with it. That's just so that we can formulate the terrain to be as close to what is functional for the particular distribution of objectives as possible. That just makes each of the missions a little bit more fair and balanced, so you don't have weird stuff happening. Now, generally speaking, all of the Master Season 3 use effectively a WTC style layout. So you can see here that this layout is very similar to one that would be found on a WTC terrain setup map. Now, the difference being that the WTC has different maps assigned to tables. So what we wanted to do for these maps is take the WTC layout that best fit the mission being played on it, and then go from there. And while these maps are very similar to a WTC layout, they aren't identical. So you'll notice some things. Some of the things that we've done is change some of the keywords on the terrain and how the terrain functions, and to recreate some of the keywords that we used in Season 2, so there wasn't too much of a culture shock there for the people playing on the server. But we also made sure that all of the maps were playable for a variety of armies. So generally speaking, we've opened up some of the spaces between obstacles and ruins so that there's space for large vehicles to get through. Things like Bane Blades, we made sure that at the very least, a Bane Blade had at least 1 or 2 avenues that it could move up the table without getting hung up on ruins. At their core, some of the WTC maps are a little bit claustrophobic and have some of these ruins very close together, and that just makes it difficult to play those big Lord of War things, and that's what we want. We want people to be able to play whatever they want and not get too punished by the terrain. Now, the WTC layouts are generally made up of just a couple varieties of terrain type. They have these ruins with the big windows in them. The windows are just about large enough to fit a 40mm base through them. So you can walk a biker or something like that through those walls if you need to. And then the big opaque ruins with no holes in them, but they do have the breachable keyword. Now, one thing that we've done is swapped around the ruin keywords a little bit. We've turned the ruins into obstacles rather than area terrain. We used the obstacle ruin technology in Season 2, which was our first map set for 9th edition, or I guess an extrapolation of our Season 1 Invitational maps, which are the first map set for 9th edition. And the obstacle terrain we found generally played better than area terrain for ruins specifically. One of the reasons is that it gives cover when you're behind the terrain, but not necessarily inside it, which means that if you give the obstacle the obscuring keyword, you can potentially remain out of line of sight but claim cover, and that makes most types of artillery a little bit less powerful. So that was one of the impetuses there. In addition, it also plays a little bit more realistically. If your models are hiding behind the obstacle, they can get cover from it, but if they're standing in front, they generally don't. And we have put bases on all of the terrain to indicate where you can stand on in order to ignore the obscuring keyword for the purposes of line of sight, but those don't generally give cover. We may end up updating how these pieces of terrain in particular work, but generally speaking, I think most of the players on the server are a lot happier with the obstacle terrain than the area terrain, so we're probably going to stick with that. The other terrain that we have is a forest style. It's difficult and gives both light and dense cover. There's also some patches of just difficult and light cover terrain, as well as a couple Munitorum crates, which give light cover to models hiding behind them and are also exposed position and scalable. In this particular situation, none of the terrain is scalable, so there's actually no way to get up to second levels. That is a change from the normal WTC map layout. We've removed the second levels out of the ruin terrain. Personal preference, I don't think that multi-level terrain really adds enough to the tactical game in order to merit its inclusion. On Tabletop Simulator specifically, it's very difficult to play with because your models either pop up to the top or you have to sort of manually jigger them around to make sure that they can fit underneath the wall. It's very confusing and difficult, and it really doesn't add too much. For the most part, the only times that multi-level terrain, especially on these WTC-style ruins, comes into play is when your opponent is trying to deny melee attacks from you, and it's just like not an interesting or interactive mode of gameplay. So all the ruins are basically just going to be linear obstacles to provide cover and obscure. So this map being Retrieval Mission, obviously each player has a short table edge deployment zone, 2 objectives just outside their deployment zone, as well as 1 in the center. The one in the center is pretty deep in their deployment zone, protected by not only this giant piece of solid rock that can protect their models, but also a piece of dense cover that they can hide in the back. Again, a little bit of additional protection from artillery. And one thing that we have done from the WTC layouts is actually swap some of the difficult terrain that they had. Difficult light cover, I think they look like big grates on the WTC maps, and we've swapped those for dense cover so that there's oftentimes a little bit more dense cover around the edges of the table than the standard WTC layout would allow. The approaches up the table are protected by the dense cover on the sides, so most of the time if you have lanes of fire between these 2 objectives, they're going to be firing through dense cover, especially if they're heavy vehicles. So this makes combat between these 2 objectives a little bit more awkward. That said, once you're in the center of the table, you have generally clean lines of sight to every part of the table besides the small areas of these 2 objectives in the corners that are protected by the obscuring terrain there. Moving on to Mission 1.2, we have Scorched Earth, map name Power Overwhelming. This is a WTC layout that we edited a little bit. In this particular case, these vents were originally just difficult terrain light cover, and they were very large. The WTC terrain pack has a 9-inch wide vent, which is sort of enormous and gets a little bit tight, especially in some of these tighter hallways. We've replaced those with terrain with the dense cover keyword. Given that each player has a large obscuring piece of terrain on their left-hand flank, this is where a lot of times you want to place artillery units because they are going to be completely out of line of sight, able to control objectives 1 and 6. However, oftentimes they're going to be firing through this area terrain here. So there is a little bit of a catch-22 if you are trying to set up artillery behind these objectives, because then this dense cover can hurt you a little bit. Given the WTC layout, the lines of sight across the table are very obscured by the L's in the center. You have very limited lines of fire between the 2 objectives here, and the crates in your deployment zone block lines of fire both incoming and outgoing out around to the flank. So it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game to try to push lines of sight around the edges, and that makes this particular mission very interesting. One of the most interesting play patterns in Scorched Earth specifically is that typically it ends up with sort of a base trade where one player will push one side very heavily and try to hold the other side. And this map layout is a little bit conducive to that because we do have the large L's in the center that you can fight over and use to block your opponent's line of sight if they're trying to do the same thing to you. That said, once you're out in the middle, objectives 2 and 5 are relatively exposed. Your opponent's entire deployment zone has pretty decent lines of sight to you as soon as they move around their crates on that side. And you're really going to have to use the cover from the obstacles and area terrain. So there is a little bit of a risk there to fight for the central objectives. Moving on to 1.3, this is Country Roads, aka Vital Intel. And I hope they take me home to the place I belong, you know? This is a little bit of an interesting one because Vital Intelligence has the ability to lock in objectives like Sweep and Clear does. The objectives are relatively exposed on this one, and we actually moved some of the terrain out of the center of the table to make you have to extend a little bit harder to hold down the objectives in the center. Now, you do have good line of sight blocking terrain in your deployment zone. Not only are the large Munitorum crates on each side of the central road here pretty good at blocking a lot of the easy lanes of fire between the two deployment zones, especially for infantry units. You also have an obscuring piece of terrain on this side, as well as a large opaque L on this side. Both players have the opportunity to move a little bit more aggressively to the objectives on their right-hand side by taking cover behind the obscuring terrain on those halves. But in order to actually control the objective, you do have to leave the obscuring terrain and get out into the center. If you do play extremely aggressively, though, you can potentially hold the two in the center a little bit more easily by dominating the position behind the Munitorum crates here, because that blocks a lot of the easy lines of fire from your opponent's deployment zone. Vital Intelligence is a mission that has the potential to really snowball if you're playing aggressively. So what we wanted to do is open up a lot of lines of fire, at least to the objectives in the center, to make it difficult for each player to dominate those center objectives. So the player going first, while they may be able to put models on all 4 of those objectives, it's going to be a little bit awkward for them to hold all 4 of those because the second player will get the first opportunity to attack them. Moving to the next map, 2.1. This is for Surround and Destroy, map name Alamo. This is a pretty standard layout. Again, the area terrain in the center were originally the difficult light cover crates. Given that the terrain was centrally located, we didn't want to replace it with dense cover, so we kept it as just the light cover. And it does make advancing onto the more defensible objectives with the opaque Ls with your side open a little bit more difficult. You do have to sort of couch your moves around that. That said, this map is pretty straightforward and does play into sort of the standard game plan of Surround and Destroy, which is that you're meant to sort of spearhead your army from the flanks directly into the center, where you can fight over these large L's that offer some pretty decent line of sight blocking, especially against your opponent's center lines. You can a lot of times string objective secured units into the shadow zone of these large opaque L's, and the L on your side of the table offers a lot of protection from your opponent's shooting. There's not a lot of special terrain or too much to say about this one. It's mostly just a straight up slugfest for the middle, and that's how it usually plays out. Back in Season 1, we originally had a cityscape style map that we named Lagrange, and we're sort of we're doing a callback to that one. With this map, this is for Battle Lines, Mission 2.2. This one's called New Lagrange. And Battle Lines, while there isn't an objective in the center between the two deployment zones, there are 2, in fact, and generally speaking, the battle focuses almost entirely on those. The WTC layout for this map had this dense cover area terrain in the back corners. That gives both players some safety against indirect fire artillery, especially behind these obstacles here, where you can potentially devolve some of the game into an artillery match where you could potentially have opposing artillery placed inside the dense cover, but also potentially out of opposing line of sight. Given the balanced nature of the Battle Lines mission, I think the games are going to play out pretty straightforward. You do have some decent line of sight blocking in the middle that your forward deploy units can take advantage of while they push forward towards the 2 main objectives in the center, but then each objective itself is protected by an obscuring ruin. But this one's going to be an interesting one, I think. I think the dynamic between having the line of sight blocking in the center and the multiple layers of line of sight blocking, so you can deploy potentially behind this ruin and then move up to hide behind the center objectives, means that despite the fact that the objectives of the mission are towards the sides, we may still see some pretty fierce fighting over the center building here, because that's some of the safest positions in the game to stand in. You also have some interesting positions in the corners as well with these Munitorum crates. Not great for ground units, but if you do have some fast flying units, they can assault the objectives on those sides from relative safety. One thing I've tried to do on the maps this season is more appropriately illuminate each player's deployment zone, I guess. So we can see on this one, I was pretty happy with how the street lighting came out. We have blue street lights on the blue player side, red street lights on the red player side. So it's a little bit more thematically appropriate, I guess, for the player of that color. Moving on to mission 2.3, the Scouring. This map's name is Night Shift. This one is a very defensively oriented map to sort of juxtapose the very aggressive nature of the Scouring. You have 3 large, effective line of sight blockers in your deployment zone or just outside your deployment zone that you can take cover behind, one of which allows you access to the objective on your side while remaining outside line of sight, whereas the other one forces you to move into line of sight, however, does potentially offer some protection from this dense cover. The Scouring is a very aggressive map and can swing very wildly either way. So one thing that we wanted to do was make all of the objectives as defensible as possible so that a player could entrench themselves along the center of the table and be very difficult to remove. And that rewards a more defensive play style in a mission that typically tends to reward more aggressive play. Well, we made a couple changes to this WTC map layout with the particular orientation of the obstacles in the deployment zones. The 2 obstacles in the center do a really good job of breaking lines of fire across the middle. There is almost no unbroken line of sight across the table, and your opponent should take little to no damage on the first turn. That said, given the obstacles are very defensively placed as well, even the first player can limit the amount of shots that the second player gets going first. Like we mentioned before, there is an objective you have access to without anyone being able to see you. You can also potentially place models, if you're fast enough, in the L on this side to make them difficult to hit. Or, because these are obstacle keyworded, you can chain units back by putting a couple of units onto the center objective, then chain back behind the wall to claim cover saves on those models. Scouring's always a really interesting knife fight to play out, and I think this map is really conducive to really interesting and aggressive games, given that both players are going to have to root each other out from these pretty defensive positions, and I think that's super fun. Taking an interstellar trip here to Tau Ceti. This is the Overrun mission 3.1. And this is one of my favorite maps. I think I was really happy with how this one came out. This is very much a spiritual successor to the Sweep and Clear map from Season 2, which was very Tau themed, but we've updated it to the new WTC formulation. Overrun is a really interesting mission to play. It plays very passively, and typically the player who can play the more aggressive game to target one side or another is the one that wins. So we've made a mission that is able to play very passively, but offers some interesting avenues to move up the table. In this case, the large crates in the center, while they aren't obscuring innately, are good at blocking line of sight, and we have reoriented the WTC style setup for these ones just slightly to offer a little bit more easy access out the sides if players want to use that to springboard an attack on their opponent's side of the table. The large L's in the middle also make it possible for a unit to move up one flank while remaining out of line of sight of enemy assets on the other flank. So it can often turn the game into a Scorched Earth style base trade where one player is going up one side of the table and the other has to attack the other side. There are some very interesting forests placed on this map in the WTC layout, and these did not change very much, although we did reorient some of the ruins in each deployment zone. The area terrain, generally speaking, is wide out in the open, but it is in a tactically pretty significant position where a unit can place here, threaten both their opponent's center and flank objectives, but then also be in a position to interact with objectives 1 and 3 on this side. However, they're in the open, but then protected by that dense cover, which means it's very difficult to protect yourself both from artillery and direct line of sight shooting, but you are rewarded for playing your units a little bit more aggressively and taking advantage of that dense cover. Now, one thing that I'd like to mention that we do for all of the T5S2 maps is we make the features on top of area terrain colliderless. While this doesn't exactly work in an in-person game, this is essentially the equivalent of having a removable tree on a base that a lot of game stores, local game stores have. And this allows you to place the models inside the terrain and interact with the scenery, but not have to reduce your movement to move around them. So while the scenery is there mostly for show and it can block your physical line of sight, it doesn't actually impact your movement at all. I think it also looks pretty cool too. These guys they're creeping through the forest. A lot of the maps as well, you probably noticed them on the new Lagrange map just like this one, have these cosmetic features on the map in addition. These are just here for show. Any lampposts, bushes, stuff like that, those vertical elements of terrain that are not themselves an obstacle, those are just there for cosmetic purposes, and those are just there to be ignored. Moving on to mission 3.2, this is Sweep and Clear, map name, Corner to Corner. This time with KH instead of C, because it's a corn kind of map, you know what I mean? But obviously Sweep and Clear uses corner deployment as well, so it all makes sense! It's such a good joke. Can blame Shuma for that one. He came up with that one. Sweep and Clear is always an interesting one to me because the fight over the center typically is where the game is decided. And while you can often fight over the side objectives, how the terrain interacts with the objective in the middle a lot of times dictates how the flow of the game goes. In this case, we didn't play around with the terrain inside the player's deployment zones almost at all, and you do have multiple layers of line of sight blocking terrain. So this is another very defensive map where it is possible to protect your whole army, but in doing so, you do give up a little bit of table space. Players can deploy models behind the Ls, the large Ls on their side, and move them out to get fairly easy lines of sight past the obscuring ruin that each player has in the center. So while immediately it may look like this is a pretty safe place to stand, if your opponent plays aggressively and places models over here, they're going to be able to attack that area. That said, there are a lot of line of sight blockers in the back of your deployment zone that you can use to place a little bit more defensively, and those ones are very difficult to get shots into, assuming that you're playing pretty conservatively. This map also has some protection from indirect fire with area terrain in the back where you can be placed, for the most part, out of line of sight behind these obstacles, but then also be inside the dense cover to be a little bit more difficult to hit. Very much like the Scouring, the obstacles in the center give you an opportunity to attack the objective in the middle while remaining relatively defensive. A lot of times, Sweep and Clear comes down to which player can trade the best for control of the middle objective. And so having an area where they can protect their units while being in range to engage means that you don't necessarily have to be the fastest army in order to fight over that objective effectively. You can also use the same trick that we talked about in the Scouring to string your objective secured units out back, take cover saves on the ones in the back to make the ones in the front a little bit more difficult to kill. One change that we did make to this mission is we reoriented the obstacles on the sides. One thing that we've learned from successive versions of Sweep and Clear maps in the past is that allowing players unobstructed control of the side objectives can snowball games very quickly. Because the objectives, just like in Vital Intelligence, lock into a player's control, if a player is able to move out and very safely control the objectives in the sides of the map, which they could potentially do if the Ls were reoriented at a different angle, that allows them to run up the primary objective score very quickly, since a lot of times they can just control these three side objectives and they don't even have to fight for the middle and can play a game of keep away, which is a less interactive game than typically we would want. So we reoriented the obstacles on the side here to allow both players relatively easy line of sight into most of them and allow players to interact with them on either side of the L. Then that brings us to our last map for the T5S2 Season 3 map pool. This is Priority Targets, map name Overgrowth. In this map, we've made some fairly drastic changes to the original WTC layout. The original layout had very clear lines of sight through the center of the table, but also a lot of difficult terrain, which would have made the game mostly a shooting match, which Priority Targets very often devolves into, given how many points can be scored by simply holding the objectives in your own deployment zone. That's less interactive than we generally want, so we want to encourage players to fight over the middle objective. In order to do that, we removed a lot of the difficult terrain in the middle and replaced it with these obstacles. The obstacles block most of the lines of sight through the center of the table. You can see that there are very scant lines from one player's deployment zone to another, and they allow units to move up the table while remaining in light cover from the obstacles and able to move in onto the center objective. One thing to keep in mind for priority targets is that before the game starts, the objectives on the edges might move. So just to make that a little bit easier with the objective zone markers that we use for these maps, I've also included a 40mm version, and the way that I recommend players move the markers around is unlock this one. You can move it up to 6 inches at the start of the game, just like the mission requires. Then use that to determine the final placement of the larger marker, and you can just use a gizmo tool to move that into place for the final position. Pretty simple stuff. Alternatively, you can use the FTC map-based objectives. That also works as well, and just delete these ones if you want. Either way works. This map has been really interesting to play on. It allows some very defensive deployments. Since you have 3 line of sight blocking pieces of terrain in your deployment zone and a large line of sight blocking piece of terrain blocking most of the lines of sight down the center of the table. The terrain on the sides as well gives a lot of interesting places that the objectives could be moved. The player on the opposing side of the table could potentially move the objectives closer towards these ruins to make their approach a little bit easier. Alternatively, you could put them into the difficult terrain here to make your opponent's approach to the objective even more difficult, or you could move it into the center, so in order to hold the objective, your opponent's models would have to be inside line of sight. I think the objective moving ability makes priority targets really interesting, and the layout of the terrain of this particular WTC template, especially with the new obstacles added to the center, gives you a lot of really interesting places to put them. Also, there's a cat on this map somewhere that's hidden, and kudos to you if you can find it. But anyway, that's the T5S2 Season 3 map pool, everybody. I hope you enjoy the maps. I think they came out pretty good this season. I'm really happy with how they came out visually, and I'm very excited to play a billion games on them. So far, all my games on the map pool have been super fun, and I hope everyone else's are going pretty well as well. Now, before I wrap up the video, I do want to give a big shout out to the Warhammer 40k WTC team. A lot of the concepts that I talked about in these maps today, a lot of that legwork was done by the WTC team themselves, given that they had to think about the position of all the objectives in addition to the maps. I've just selected the layout that I think works best with each of those particular mission setups, and then rejiggered them a little bit, like I mentioned, to make the placement a little bit more flexible and to protect the objectives a little bit more. But the WTC team has done an immense amount of work to build out this format and make these terrain setups as balanced as they possibly can be. I put a link in the description down to the Warhammer 40k WTC website. If you want to read the map rules themselves, I highly recommend you do that. And it seems to me a lot of online tournaments are moving towards using WTC maps. And from what I've seen, a lot of in-person play as well is going to be moving closer to a WTC standard of terrain. It's going to be, I think, a lot like the new Nova standard that we had back in 8th edition. Like almost every competitive event you went to was Nova L's with a Nova Ruin setup, and I think the WTC setup is going to be something very similar for 9th edition, which honestly I'm super cool with because these missions tend to have very good coverage and be very balanced for a wide variety of army styles. Now, all of these maps are created with the feedback from the community in the Discord. If you want to engage in that discussion, there's a T5S2 general discussion over on the Tactical Tortoise Discord. I would highly recommend you go over there and check it out. Weigh in with your opinions because we do update these maps very often according to feedback. Right now, we're very much experimenting with this version of the obstacle terrain. I think it plays better than area terrain, but there is a non-zero chance that these terrain features could move back to being area terrain at some point in the not-too-distant future. Again, that's all based on player feedback, so if you have your 2 cents, go ahead, join us over in the Discord server and let us know. Anyway, thanks everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of the T5S2 Season 3 map pool, and I hope I see a lot of you over on this server to play with us. We're playing a ton of games of Warhammer 40k, and man, is it super fun. We have a lot of external events as well that are being added to the T5S2 rankings. I think Season 3 is probably going to be our most populous season yet, with a lot of larger GT-style events getting added as well, which is going to be incredible. I'm so excited for the future of online competitive Warhammer 40k, and I think it's going to be great. Thanks everybody again for watching. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. Big shout out to my patron members over at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. If you want to get into a T5S2 Season 3 pod as quickly as humanly possible, then go ahead and drop a patronage. Patrons get added from the waitlist before any of the other players, so they do get a little bit ahead of the curve there. That said, our rapid fire and other events are first come, first serve, so you have an equal chance of getting into those, even if you're not a patron. Patreon supporters also get early access to most of the videos, as well as some exclusive videos and all sorts of other goodies. Also, YouTube members, those people are sweet. They get some sweet emojis as well that they can use on the channel, so that's pretty cool. And also, big thanks to just the people who watch the videos all the time. Y'all are great, and I love you. Thanks for watching again. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.